Welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks, and we've been talking about the federal government. And we've been talking about federal government all semester. We've been talking this last presentation about the bureaucracy. And I mentioned that the federal bureaucracy are the muscles of government. And we are in the midst of a process. Obviously, we had an election. Donald Trump won re-election. And now he is in the process of filling out the positions for a lot of bureaucratic heads. Among the recent nominations that he has made include Pete Hegseth, who is basically a Fox News journalist. And I use the word journalist kind of loosely. He is kind of a television personality. He is a former veteran. He's going to, according to Trump, be the Secretary of Defense. And then, let's see, Tulsi Gabbard, a former Democratic representative from Hawaii, who is now switched over to the Republican Party. He has nominated her to be the Director of National Intelligence. And then he has also tapped former Florida congressman who just actually resigned from the House of Representatives, Matt Gaetz, to be Attorney General. These are, I think, it would be ironic to call them interesting selections. Many Republicans seem to be shocked by these nominations, particularly the one related to Matt Gaetz. Now, the median age of all three of these guys three of these people, obviously Miss Gabbard is a woman. The median age of these folks is about 43. Most people would basically argue that these folks lack kind of the basic experiential foundation necessary to do these jobs. I will tell you that certainly the Department of Defense is the largest bureaucracy in the world. No one walks into that job knowing everything that they're going to need to know. You have to surround yourself with the right people, but you also have to have relevant life experience. Now, Pete Hegseth is a veteran. He has served in combat, I believe both in Iraq and Afghanistan. I honor his service, but carrying a rifle doesn't put you in a position to understand everything that you need to understand in order to be Secretary of Defense. Most of the people who have served as Secretary of Defense have either been in kind of CEO relevant positions, people like Robert McNamara, who had served in World War II and also had headed the Ford Company. He had been one of the planners of America's European and Pacific bombing campaigns during World War II. He had a ton of managerial experience. Likewise, you talk about people like John Negroponte, who had a long service in the State Department and in a variety of roles, in heading up diplomatic missions. Again, had a wealth of experience relevant to managing the position of Director of National Intelligence, which is a relatively new position that hasn't necessarily carved out a clear role for itself within the intelligence community, which is relatively decentralized, and some people would argue are fairly balkanized. Gabbard, basically has served as a junior officer in the Hawaii National Guard. Again, I honor her service. I don't believe that kind of service, is relevant to directing, to being the head of our intelligence community. Matt Gaetz has, I don't believe, ever practiced law. He earned his Juris Doctorate in 2008. By 2010, he was already serving in the Florida legislature. He's been a politician his entire adult life, pretty much. And frankly, again, this is a guy who does not strike me as having the judgment and the independence necessary to be Attorney General. Attorneys Generals have to make very important, difficult decisions about how the law should be enforced. The one thing all three of these folks share with Donald Trump, is hostility to the federal government. And the one thing that unites all three of these folks is personal loyalty to Donald Trump. So the question is going to come when these folks put their hand in the air and put their other hand on a Bible and swear an oath to the Constitution, have they already sworn a superseding oath to Donald Trump? That is deeply troubling. Again, I will say this specifically about Matt Gaetz. The one thing he shares with Donald Trump is a simmering hatred of the Department of Justice, because Matt Gaetz has been investigated by the Department of Justice for sex trafficking. He still has an ethics investigation out by the House, which some people believe is why he resigned abruptly, because they were days away from releasing a report basically substantiating or providing a report on evidence related to accusations that Matt Gaetz had engaged in sexual relations with an underage teenager and took her to another jurisdiction, which is trafficking. So we live in interesting times. We're going to have to see what comes from this. But as I noted on this initial slide, the federal bureaucracy are the muscles of government. They are going to do the will of the political branches of government. And again, the question is going to be, will the Senate sign off on these, frankly, eccentric choices for these very important, positions within the federal government? One of the things that I'll tell, kind of close this with, is that oftentimes the bureaucracy doesn't know how to act because interbranch conflict between the presidency and Congress puts them in an untenable position. To some extent, some people have interpreted these nominations as a dare by Donald Trump to the Senate, daring, to Senate Republicans who now control the Senate, or who will come January, that if they defy him, that they will face the wrath of Donald Trump's voters. And for those folks who are likely up for re-election in 2026, that is likely a threat that is going to be very concerning to them. He has also threatened to adjourn Congress. He does have that constitutional authority. It has never been exercised. A president has never, basically told Congress to go away for understandable reasons, because it would be viewed as dictatorial. And the question is, what is the extent of a president's power to basically forcibly adjourn Congress? And how long can a president hold Congress in adjournment? It may be that he will attempt to suspend Congress and force them into adjournment. And then the Republicans who control both houses of Congress will have a decision to make. Do they stay out? Do they simply go back home and allow Donald Trump to do whatever he wants with the federal government? Or do they stand up to this president who just won, the first Republican president since 2004 to win the popular vote? We live in interesting times. So we're going to talk about two things today. We're going to talk about, who are bureaucrats? What kind of people end up serving in the federal bureaucracy? We oftentimes hear these really mean things said about people who are, who work for the federal government. I think you'll find that most of them are good, decent people who are doing oftentimes highly technical, highly difficult jobs. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the management of the bureaucracy. We're going to be looking at this in real time. This is kind of an experiment in terms of what can be done to control a federal bureaucracy that's getting orders from a president that may or may not be constitutional. So who are bureaucrats? Again, we also call them civil servants. Many of them are scientists, many of them are lawyers, many of them are doctors. They do things that are related to the public good. They are part of what our government has created in an effort to promote the general welfare. So who are Americans? Again, if you look at gender, women comprise 51% of our population. They are 43% of the federal bureaucracy, which means, again, that women are slightly underrepresented, as they are in most areas of government. Likewise, by race and ethnicity, you'll find, again, that it's actually not too badly out of whack. There are, frankly, more black Americans serving in the federal bureaucracy than there are in terms of the overall population. They're slightly overrepresented. Latinos are slightly underrepresented. Whites comprise 60% of the population, but 62% of the federal bureaucracy. I think most people would say that's not too badly out of whack in terms of representativeness. When you look at education, only about 11% 11% of the population lack a high school education. Less than 1% of federal people working in the federal government, and most of those people are working in kind of custodial jobs. 27% only have a high school degree. Only about a quarter of federal workers do. 29% have some college. 19% of government workers have at least some college, maybe an associate's degree. 20% of the American public has a college degree. 28% of government workers have at least a college degree. Only 13% of Americans have postgraduate degrees. 28% of government workers. And what does that tell you? It means that it's an important metric to be a government worker, that you have some kind of you at least have a college degree, or you may have some postgraduate work. This is a really telling one. When people talk about firing 50,000 government workers. Of the U.S. population that's served in the military, only 7% of Americans in the U.S. population have actually served. Close to a third of government workers are veterans. So if you're talking about wholesale layoffs, you're going to be laying off a lot of people who are veterans. That's going to have an impact. That's going to have an effect on people's perceptions of what the Trump administration is doing when they talk about firing 50,000 mid-level civil servants and then replacing them with loyalists to the person of Donald Trump. You also, it's important to keep in mind, there are close to 280,000 government employees that work in the D.C., in the District of Columbia area. But that's only about a quarter of the population. 85% of federal employees live and work in the United States. And if you think about it, the U.S. Postal Service is a perfect illustration of that. In fact, the U.S. Postal Service is what we would call forward deployed. There are far more people working for the U.S. Postal Service that live and work in the states where they are than live and work in the District of Columbia. The same is true of the State Department. Although in that case, most of those folks that are located in the District of Columbia, those are kind of the leadership, and everybody else is spread far and wide. But actually, interestingly, a number of them also are in this, in the United States, in the various, in the 50 states, because part of the State Department's role is to try and find people who would make good diplomats. Okay. So you have this idea that public administration is a separate function. It is not political, right? That was the whole point. The bureaucratic agencies really for much of our history were partisans. This was a period really from the founding until well into the 19th century. It's a period that was where civil service hiring and firing was dictated by what was known as the spoils system. And that's based on the whole, the idea to the victor belong the spoils. And in this instance, the spoils of partisan, elections are civil service jobs. And so the problem begins to emerge in the middle of the 19th century as the size, as the Louisiana Purchase is causing more and more states to be added, there are more and more kinds of complex tasks of governing that are taking place, okay? And this is like a syllogism that I oftentimes will tell people. More people means more government. You're going to have more government involvement to adjudicate conflicts, to manage the distribution of goods. That is simply a reality, okay? And so really one of the first presidents to complain openly about the obligations of finding jobs for all the job seekers coming to the White House was Abraham Lincoln. And keep in mind, again, he was in the midst of a civil war. And so, in the midst of trying to manage this great conflict, you've got job seekers coming hat in hand saying, I helped you get elected in New Hampshire. I want a job. And, Lincoln wrote to a friend and said, I am constantly besieged by job seekers. I don't have enough jobs for all these people. So the spoils system began to become unworkable in the middle of the 19th century. By the post-Civil War era, there's another complicating factor, and that is industrialization, and with that, urbanization. Again, more people living in large urban areas, more government, right? And so also what you're seeing is that the relationship between the government and the economy is becoming more and more troublesome because, again, the economy is growing. People at the top of the economy have greater and greater wealth. Think of the equivalent of Elon Musk back in the 19th century. These people had, enormous capacity. This was an era before, campaign finance laws. And you had mining magnates literally buying Senate seats. It was grotesque in terms of the corruption. And frankly, we have yet to reckon with the reality that these people sitting on top of these social media platforms, like Elon Musk, are now wielding enormous influence. And, Musk he's being tasked, and he's outside of government. Apparently, it's not going to be a formal government position, and he certainly would not withstand much scrutiny from the Senate, even with the 53 votes. But he's being tasked to manage, to look after government efficiency, and he holds billions of dollars in government contracts. That is an innate conflict of interest. The other guy that's working with him, Vivek Ramaswamy, who was a guy that ran for president as a Republican as well, likewise has serious potential conflicts of interest. And how these folks are going to navigate the appearance, not to mention the reality of these conflicts of interest, is frankly going to be interesting. So you begin to see during the Progressive era the idea of reformers looking at education as the key to creating, and managing what was increasingly an unwieldy government. Okay, and so Woodrow Wilson was really one of the first political scientists. He was the first political scientist to be elected president, the first guy who was kind of an expert on government. And he is the guy that in the late 19th century wrote a famous article basically talking and describing about how public administration is distinct from the political acts that the constitutional branches of government engage in. The point for Wilson was that these are experts and that they don't care about politics. They don't have an interest in who wins an election. Their only job is to implement the will of the political branches of government. And so the challenge has always been that presidents, because again, you're really beginning in the 20th century, presidents have to be seen controlling and in control of events in the world. And that creates a challenge because, they want to be in direct control over the federal bureaucracy. Now, I will tell you, there are some parts of the federal bureaucracy that need to be independent. And I mentioned a little while ago with the Attorney General. The whole point of having an Attorney General over the Department of Justice is that they have to maintain a certain amount of separation from politics. If people view the Department of Justice as a cudgel that is being wielded for partisan ends. That was one of the things that Trump complained about continually with all the different criminal accusations that had been leveled against him. They were calling it lawfare. Well, now you look at a guy who lacks the experience, lacks the judgment, and frankly lacks the integrity to be Attorney General, is now now being tapped for that position. Does anyone think that the Department of Justice is not going to be used as a political weapon? So presidents want responsive competence. The problem, though, is that what presidents want is not always best either for the government or for them personally, right? If you're appointing people who are incompetent, you're not going to get that cabinet level segment of the bureaucracy working effectively and efficiently. Okay, so government is most effective and efficient when the bureaucratic agencies are impartial and independent. And presidents have historically placed political appointees with ties either to the president or to the party. Now, again, at this point, Donald Trump has converted the Republican Party into it is the Trump Party. Either these folks are the people that have won election in the House of Representatives and the Senate are either openly MAGA or they are so cowed that they lack independence. So one of the things that has happened again is you've got this idea, this tension between responsive competence and neutral competence. And neutral competence is increasingly coming under threat. Okay. Meanwhile, you also have, going all the way back to the 1980s, arguments about the size of the federal government. And that creates two twin kind of impulses. On the one hand, to downsize, and on the other hand, to privatize. And there are consequences that flow to both of those kinds of actions. On the one hand, when you're talking about downsizing, you're talking about reducing the size of the federal government. Well, again, if you're reducing the size of the federal government and federal agencies, you are reducing those agencies' capacity to act. Those agencies exist for a reason. Those reasons seemed good at the time. It may be that some agencies have outlived their utility. But when you talk about the big one that Republicans want to get rid of now, they're talking about Project 2025. They were talking about eliminating the Department of Education. Well, one of the things the Department of Education does is manage student loans, which is a huge federal program. They're talking about shifting it over to Treasury or whatever. That is going to cause disruptions, and that is going to make it harder for students to get access to student loans. Now, if it were up to me, I would be finding better ways to subsidize access to education. I'm an educator. I would like to make it easier for people to pursue an education if they want to. I don't think it should be obligatory for people to think that they need a college education. Nevertheless, I would rather see, rather than loans, I would rather see more in the way of, I'd rather see an expansion of the Pell Grant program. I would like to see a reduction of the average cost of college. I am not one of those educators. I'm not a Bernie Sanders type that believes in free education, because I know, our American culture does not value things that are free. So, that's just my take on it. But downsizing is going to involve basically reducing the capacity of agencies to do things. Privatizing is where you're basically taking what had previously been a government function and contracting it to a private company. Now, that has the perceived advantage of reducing the size of government, but it has the disadvantage of also reducing accountability, because private contractors are not kind of compelled to do the same kinds of things as government workers are. If you look at what happened in rebuilding New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, they contracted that out, and they found that there were enormous cost overruns that the government was ultimately on the hook for. And that placed an enormous financial burden on the state of Louisiana to fund those costs. If the government had been doing it, and if the Army Corps of Engineers had been tasked with it, now yes, they created the problem, but they should have known how to fix it. That would have probably overall been cheaper for the American people. And so there's pros and cons to just about everything you talk about doing. Yeah, if you downsize, it costs less. But if you downsize, you also get less in the way of performance. Populating the bureaucracy. Again, up until the 1880s, you had the spoils system in place. The Pendleton Act was actually created because of the assassination of Republican President James Garfield. And it basically was reflecting what was now well known, and it was known for decades, that the spoils system was not working, and it was a bad way of populating the civil service. And keep in mind, every time the government switched hands, you had people who were government workers out on the streets. And so it created enormous anxiety and uncertainty. And that's just not good, right? So the idea behind the Pendleton Act was to replace the spoils system with a merit-based system for staffing federal agencies. In other words, you would have experts, civil servants who were impersonal and not interested in politics, and that they would persist over time. Now, what that helps to do within an agency is to create what is known as institutional memory, right? You understand the processes of government better. You are in a better position to manage those challenges over time because you have people in place that have decades of experience. And having, individual people, and I can tell you this is, here at Rogers State University, one of the big challenges that we've had is that we've had a lot of people who have been working at RSU for 20 or 30 years retiring. Losing that institutional memory comes at a very high cost. Institutional memory takes a long time to build up. And when you lose it, it's not something that you can just replace immediately. You also had in 1978 the Civil Service Reform Act, which enhanced the Merit Systems Protection Board and also enhanced protection of civil servants from retaliation. That was kind of something that would come later with the Whistleblower Protection Act, which I'll talk about shortly. You also have the Federal Labor Relations Authority, which administers collective bargaining for federal employees and also adjudicates personnel grievances. It's oftentimes said that it's really hard to fire a civil servant. And that's true because, again, they have protections against retaliation. And so oftentimes that does produce, a lot of people talk about it in higher education with tenure. It's very hard to break a person's tenure and discharge them. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It comes at a cost, which means it's sometimes harder to fire someone who is bad at their job. But it also means you don't have politicians sticking their noses into what's going on college campuses and saying, well, we're going to clean house because we don't like you people. We think you're of the wrong party. You're of the wrong persuasion. Again, that eliminates a lot of important institutional memory. You also have the OPM, which is the Office of Personnel Management, and that is responsible for recruitment, testing, and training of federal employees. So again, if you get the idea, maybe I want to work for the federal government, you would probably be filling out a form with the Office of Personnel Management, and they would then go about trying to figure out what your skill set is, and then if they do decide to hire you, they would put you through training. Over 1,000 of the 4,000 political appointees at the top federal agencies require Senate confirmation, 1,000 people. Now, again, it is significant that Donald Trump is saying, I want Congress to go into recess so that I can just jumpstart this and appoint so many of these people without Senate confirmation. And again, Republicans in the Senate do that. If they do make that decision, they do it at a potentially high cost because every abuse these folks engage in, having not been vetted, every instance of incompetence goes directly to the Senate because they didn't do their job. They didn't do their constitutional duty to advise and consent to these appointees. Many political appointees, again, have personal ties to the president. This is unprecedented, what Donald Trump is doing. He is doing very similarly to what Stalin did in Soviet Russia in the 1920s. He populated the party with personal loyalists. When they weren't good enough to do the job, he offed them and then sent somebody else in and said, don't end up like that guy, right? Presidents will often use appointments to signal messages about their management style. As the first black American president, Barack Obama nominated 7 women and 10 people of color to serve in his first cabinet, while George W. Bush and Donald Trump selected people more often with business backgrounds. If you look at Donald Trump's first cabinet, he had 1 black person, he had 1 Asian woman, everybody else was white, and most of them were male. So again, what kinds of appointees, what other kinds of appointees is Donald Trump going to make? Right now, it appears to me that the dominant overriding factor is personal loyalty. That is a dangerous criteria. for a president to say, that's my main goal, is to make sure people are going to do exactly what I want to do when I want to do it. And again, one of the things that kept Donald Trump, a lot of people are saying, well, he didn't do it in his first term. And that's because he had people pushing back on his impulses. Okay? He won't have anybody pushing back on his impulses in this term. It doesn't appear. You also have an important body, and this is called the Senior Executive Service, this is the otherwise known as the SES. This is typically, these are the top management ranks for career civil servants. Again, if you serve in the State Department and you become a Foreign Service officer, which is basically a very elite rank, but it's not an ambassador or manager of a consulate. If you reach that level of FSO and you want to become an ambassador, probably your most likely pathway, once you've gotten a certain amount of experience and are well regarded within the State Department, probably your best path is to join the SES. This was created in 1978. It was designed to foster this idea of public management professionalism, which again, oftentimes you get these kind of people that are not experts in government that are heading these important bureaucratic agencies and cabinets. And so the idea is you want a professional class of people under them that can serve as deputies, that can serve as undersecretaries, that have the requisite expertise, and again, that word I used, that phrase I used, institutional memory, that will help that person understand if they choose to, right? If the political appointed head chooses to listen to the people who have experience, then they'll probably be better managers of those cabinet departments and agencies. So it comes with an exchange, right? You have to basically sacrifice certain civil service protections, but in exchange, SES employees can move much higher into the upper reaches of the federal bureaucracy, and that gives presidents another pool of competent career civil servants that can help them out, okay? The size of the federal bureaucracy, again, critics from going back to the 1970s have attacked the bloated size of the federal bureaucracy, that has basically been part and parcel of the decline in trust that many Americans feel because, again, most Americans don't study government. And so when you constantly hear this drumbeat, the government is too large, the government is sclerotic, the government is inefficient, then people just automatically they keep saying it must be true, okay? The reality is that the size of the federal government has declined remarkably over the course of many years. And in fact, the federal government remains, on average, very good at what they do. During the Clinton administration, Al Gore Jr. led what was known as a national performance review of the entire federal service as part of what was known as reinventing government. And again, they did a lot in terms of cutting costs and reducing the size of government. And in fact, the Clinton years were actually a period of very good government. Whether you liked Bill Clinton or not, he was a good president. He was good at being president. So reforms over the decades have reduced the overall size of the federal bureaucracy by roughly $400,000, or 400,000 people, which has created the dilemma of, again, if you keep doing more with less, what's the problem? Pretty soon you're trying to do everything with nothing, okay? And that becomes unmanageable, where you literally can't do your job because you have steadily have your budgets cut and your personnel cut. So the reduction in the size of the federal government has oftentimes resulted in increasing the size and contracting activities at the state and local government. This is something that Republicans have said they have wanted since the 1970s, was to have more of the governing take place at the state and local level. Okay? Well, they're getting their wish, and again, what's the problem? Well, many states don't have the resource capacity to do all the things that citizens expect of them. And so you end up with lots and lots of complaints about the lack of certain government services. And again, part of what got Donald Trump elected was this sense on the part of many people that they were being displaced by undocumented immigrants, that their access to federal resources was being taken away and given to someone that they didn't think deserved it. So this slide kind of shows you again the overall the gradual and in some instances dramatic diminution. Again, in the number of employees as a percentage of the national workforce from the 1950s to 2022. And again, it really is a tiny fraction of American workers that are federal employees. So contracting, again, calls for reduction in the size and scope of government have led to a dramatic increase in the number of federal contractors. Federal contractors, it can be defined as a privately owned and operated company that compete for contracts with the federal government, compete with other private companies for contracts in the federal government, and that a significant proportion of their profits are derived from federal contracts. In fact, Elon Musk is well on his way to becoming a trillionaire on the basis of government contracts through SpaceX and other agency, other companies that he runs. So again, privatization comes with a cost. The more you rely on private contractors, the less, frankly, expertise the federal government has. When you think of the Deepwater Horizon explosion that took place in the Gulf of Mexico, if there was a government agency that had specialized in plugging deepwater wells, that situation might have been managed better. Instead, you had to rely on the petroleum industry to try and cap that leak, and they had not developed that expertise, even though they were increasingly committed to deep water drilling. If they had been more responsible, that horrific ecological disaster that has really significantly damaged the Gulf of Mexico would have been averted. So again, advocates argue that contracting reduces the footprint of government and increases efficiency. Critics basically say, yeah, not so much on the efficiency part. And in fact, quite often, contracting ends up costing more money. You think about what happened during the Iraq and Afghanistan, the long periods of occupation. It used to be the U.S. Army and the military generally fed its own people. They had commissary services. Now they contract. And if you're a soldier, you can get a pizza, you can get, McDonald's, you can get what you want. But it comes at a much higher cost, and oftentimes the soldiers themselves have to pay it. Now they get combat pay for, all that kind of stuff, but nevertheless, it is costing more to feed troops in wartime than it would have if they simply did it themselves. Managing the bureaucracy. Again, you have to understand how the president, Congress, the judiciary, and even the public and the bureaucracy itself can try to manage the bureaucracy. Okay, so the basic challenge of bureaucracy is that the larger it is, the more authority it has, the more discretion it has, the less potentially democratic is the politics, right? So is rule by experts compatible with democratic governance? Okay? The constitutional roots for bureaucracy come from Article 2, Section 2, which gives presidents the appointment authority. That same passage also requires the president to require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments. And again, at the time this was written, there were no executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. So you also have, again, Article 2, Section 3, that grants broad authority to executive powers to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that, again, means a certain amount of administrative discretion. Because if you have a law that basically creates a large category of people who are potential criminals, you have to understand that comes with a cost. Right? The war on drugs is a perfect illustration of that. If we arrested everybody that consumed illegal drugs, we would have had a prison population. We already have the largest prison population in the world as a result of the war on drugs. And so you have to exercise a certain amount of discretion, both in terms of police deciding who are the worst malefactors, the most likely to be violent, and then prosecutors in determining how many of these folks can we successfully prosecute at any given time. Look at the January 6th prosecutions. They put over 1,000 people in jail. Overwhelmingly, those were people who were not just on the Capitol grounds, that were not simply protesting, that didn't simply walk into the Capitol and then walk out. These were people who were damaging property. These are people who were attacking police officers. And now you're talking about Donald Trump pardoning people who assaulted police officers. I think that's going to be controversial. I could be wrong. So there are two important questions that come from this. Do the constitutional branches of government have sufficient authority over an unelected bureaucracy? And do the separated institutions sharing power agree on how to control the bureaucracy? Okay? First and foremost, the president has the most direct control. The president is the largest employer in the country and the largest purchaser of goods and services in the world. Okay? There are innate management challenges associated with the management and control of the bureaucracy by the president. The first power that they have is the appointment power. You put people over those bureaucracies, you give them a certain amount of faith, right? That is sort of the MBA, the Master's in Business Administration approach to being president. That's what George W. Bush said. He was one of the first MBA presidents. And he basically said, I'm going to appoint the people I like and trust and believe have the right expertise, and then I'm going to give them a certain amount of discretion to do their jobs. Again, the challenge is, in some instances, those folks can go native. Those folks can be overwhelmed by the task. You also, as president, have the ability to use the Office of Management and Budget to control certain bureaucratic activities. You can control the rate at which bureaucratic agencies are spending money, for example. You can force audits of how agencies are spending money. So the OMB is a potentially really significant power. You also can appoint what are known as policy czars. These are task forces that typically have responsibilities for specific policy needs. As presidents, both George Herbert Walker Bush and Barack Obama resorted to dozens of task forces of this nature to try and deal with specific problems. During his first term, Donald Trump created a pandemic task force, comprised of experts and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Director of the National Institutes of Health, the Director of the Centers for Disease Control. He did that in January of late 2020. Policy czars typically report directly to the president, and they typically do not require Senate confirmation. Congressional control, again, Congress can change the location or the structure of agencies. I mentioned earlier that Congress can draft legislation that changes an agency head from a single person, a single director, to a board, right? They can also redistribute policy responsibilities. One of the problems that we're witnessing right now as a result of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump in the summer, this past summer, is the Secret Service, right? Historically, the Secret Service was attached to the Department of Treasury. That was changed basically following the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and the Secret Service was located within the Department of Homeland Security. However, the Secret Service still has responsibility for managing financial crimes, for investigating financial crimes. Now, a lot of people argue that one of the reforms, first and foremost, the Secret Service needs to be staffed up better. They also need more specific training. They need to be better trained in what it is that they're supposed to be doing. It is a very specific skill set to be able to look at any particular venue and see where are the points of vulnerability, what are some things we need to do. Do we need to have, is the threat environment sufficiently high that we need to have plexiglass screens around the president at this particular venue? Can we shut off all potential high ground points of access that would, like this kid, he got up on a roof. He had a direct shot from, like 140 yards, which is not, and nearly anybody could have executed that shot. Donald Trump was very fortunate that the person that was trying to kill him was simply not a very good shot. And so, and I am not saying anything. I want to hasten to add that I do not advocate assassination as a tool of politics. I am saying that the Secret Service needed to do a better job of identifying where the threats were and close those off so that people like this deranged kid, don't have that kind of access, don't even have the temptation. Congress can also change, again, the administrative structure. So again, one of the things that people are talking about, there was a recent investigation into the Secret Service, and they're saying, you need to take financial crimes away from them. That is a mission. Again, what is the problem here? It's the Katrina problem, right? When FEMA got shoved into the Department of Homeland Security, it was one department among many in a department whose primary area of focus and priority was combating terrorism. Okay. Likewise, Congress has oversight authority, and that generally comes in two forms. Police patrol oversight is basically where you are doing routine hearings with agency heads and figuring out what challenges they're dealing with, and as a result, what kind of resources they might need, or what kind of tasks might need to be added to what it is that they're doing. The fire alarm approach, in contrast, is a situation where you're basically saying, this agency has acted badly, this agency has done something that is sufficiently problematic that it has now caused public alarm, and so we're looking at you guys with a critical eye. We want to understand why this state of affairs happened, and we want to resolve it as quickly as possible. Right? Fire alarm oversight is basically, we want to put out the fire, and we want to do it right now. An important tool of good government is the idea of inspectors general. The importance of the Inspector General Act of 1978 cannot be overstated. This is something that, again, it was passed by a Democratic Congress during the administration of Jimmy Carter. Inspectors General's offices are located in every major department. These are folks who are professional public advocates. They are almost all lawyers, and their job is basically to have an office that fields potential complaints about how a bureaucratic agency is doing their job. Okay? So these folks, and there is actually an inspectors general kind of union. They share information. They share best practices in terms of how to manage an office. So agency heads are typically barred from interfering in Inspector General investigations. That is written into the legislation of the Inspector General Act. Following his first impeachment in 2019 or 2020, it was 2020, Donald Trump unilaterally fired several inspectors general, including the Department of Justice, the Department of State, and the Department of Defense. The reason was that those inspector generals were investigating allies of his. That kind of illustrated and demonstrated a flaw in the law, that the President of the United States could, without cause, fire somebody who was conducting an investigation. So again, this is an instance where Donald Trump has revealed a chink in the armor of the federal government, and he is working hard to convert the entire federal government to his will. You also have what are known as the Big Three. These are congressional agencies, and among the Big Three, the General Accounting Office is ultimately the supreme auditing institution of the federal government. They can audit any federal agency and determine whether or not funds are being abused or not. This is one thing that happens routinely, where you'll get an agency head that they'll get kind of loose with money in terms of funding for federal training. And instead of these guys conducting training, what they're really doing is going to Las Vegas and and basically throwing federal money around in terms of their own personal enjoyment. That is something that will draw GAO scrutiny if they hear rumors to that effect. You have a problem too, and that is that again the president and Congress will struggle for bureaucratic control. A classic example of this was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. This was created as a result of the collapse of the subprime mortgage industry, and actually even further, even earlier than that, there were consumer abuses that were alleged that caused Congress to basically pass a law requiring all CEOs to basically swear that the financial reports, the financial statements that are being produced, that they know what they're doing, and that this is fair and honest, kind of a truth in reporting practices. But the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act was again designed to protect consumers. And so they created basically a regulatory body that looks after and investigates complaints of consumer abuse. Okay, the CFPB was the brainchild of then Harvard University professor Elizabeth Warren, now Massachusetts senator. Republicans didn't like it. They didn't like it from the start. They didn't like the way it was funded. One of the ways that Democrats have come to realize that regulatory bodies can be basically robbed of resources. This is something that Republicans have done to the Internal Revenue Service basically every time they've had control of Congress, or every time they've had control of the House of Representatives. They have proposed cutting the budget of the Internal Revenue Service. And so Democrats figured out ways, and this is something that Elizabeth Warren kind of helped do. They basically made the consumer, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, they made it capture resistant. And that by locating its funding source within the Federal Reserve, it is basically funded through the fees that the Federal Reserve charges to banks. And that means that Congress really can't use the budgetary process to cut its funding whenever Republicans get in control of Congress. Now, Congress basically challenged that funding mechanism and said that it was unconstitutional, that all executive branch agencies have to basically be subject to to Congress. The courts have to this point held the funding mechanisms to be constitutional. But nevertheless, they have consistently challenged those kinds of things. And again, this is something where you had a president that wanted to populate the CFPB, and you had Congress when after 2010, where Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, and they were like, no, we're not going to let you appoint people. And certainly after 2014, when they took control of the Senate, they simply didn't allow Barack Obama to make a lot of appointments, which again created a lot of tension between the presidency and Congress. You also have the idea of judicial oversight, okay? As a result of Marbury versus Madison, this is a landmark decision in 1803, which we will discuss in our next week's presentations on the federal judiciary. The executive branch actions are judged to be subject to judicial review. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that the Supreme Court and federal courts generally have the power to hear cases alleging, in instances where they have standing, where a plaintiff has standing, they have the ability to say that an executive branch action, be it the president or be it some other agency within the executive branch, that what they are doing is unconstitutional. Okay, that is a significant power. Again, to the extent that courts have used that power, they have generally used it sparingly. This current court appears to have been far more willing to use those powers in ways that are highly activist in nature. Courts also settled disputes between Congress and the executive branch agencies about the interpretation of laws. I am thinking of an example and nothing springs to mind. Judges also monitor the implementation of laws by providing a legal venue, again, for people adversely affected by a regulation or adjudication. This is important, for example, busing that occurred in the 1970s. This was a result of civil rights complaints that basically white-dominated cities were shunting black kids into really poorly funded schools, and so federal courts basically, basically held those municipal governments in, they held them liable under the Civil Rights Act, and they basically said, you're going to have to bus black kids into white districts. We're going to force integration, which was again an enormously controversial action, and created a lot of political controversy. It created riots. Massachusetts was one of the areas again where there was an enormous amount of opposition to busing. So judges are responsible again for monitoring whether a law is being followed. You can look, it's not necessarily a federal instance, but Rudy Giuliani, who had been Donald Trump's, one of his chief legal counsels, had made allegations against two election workers in Georgia, arguing that they were, basically engaging in fraud in counting the ballots. That was libelous, and he was held liable. He was held in civil court to have libeled them, and they were, these two folks, Ruby Freeman and somebody, I can't remember the other one's name, somebody Ross, their mother and sister, or mother and daughter. They were awarded like $200 million. I can't remember the exact number, but it was an enormous judgment against Rudy Giuliani. The judge in that case has been overseeing Giuliani's, following that court order, and basically he has held Giuliani, I believe, in contempt because Giuliani has been obviously and deliberately avoiding paying up. Okay, so that's an example of a judge basically saying there's been a court has rendered a judgment, and you are responsible as as the person against whom the judgment was leveled. You have an obligation to follow the directives of the court, and you fail to do so under jeopardy. You can be put in jail for contempt. Another very important way that bureaucracies can be actually held accountable is the idea of whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is a phenomenon where someone within the federal bureaucracy points to wrongdoing. Okay. Now, typically, well-run bureaucracies, and frankly, for that matter, well-run businesses, have a process for people to say, have a complaint. They have a complaint box where you can basically say, here is what is wrong, and here is this practice is against the law, or this practice is abusive, or this practice is corrupt. And if you go through normal channels and things actually are worked out, well, that's well and good. The problem oftentimes is that people who are invested in the status quo, in the management positions, will raise the costs of someone dissenting. They will threaten retaliation. Within the framework of the federal government, the Whistleblower Protection Act is designed to protect civil servants who report agency malfeasance to the Office of Special Counsel, which is, again, this is a legal office. Their job is to field those kinds of legal complaints. And once you basically trigger whistleblower protection, once you file a report, you are basically protected from retaliation. Now, I would note, Donald Trump's first impeachment was the result of a whistleblower report on a telephone call between Donald Trump and the newly elected Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. In that instance, what was happening, again, even back in 2019 when this call was made, Ukraine had been involved in a civil war. It was really a proxy war where Vladimir Putin had funded and trained and armed Ukrainian Russians, people who spoke Russian rather than Ukrainian, in eastern Ukraine. And so there had been a 10-year-long simmering civil war in those areas of Ukraine, those provinces in eastern Ukraine. And the United States has been helping Ukraine because we don't want to see Ukraine get reconquered by Russia. And so Donald Trump made a phone call to Volodymyr Zelensky, wherein he said, I'd love to give you these, this military aid and commercial aid, but in order for me to release that money, you have to announce that you have launched a criminal investigation into Joe Biden and into his son, Hunter Biden. That was really all. And I think in the phone call, he said, you don't actually have to investigate. You just have to announce it. Okay? That kind of tells you what Donald Trump was trying to do. In 2019, he viewed Joe Biden as the most significant threat to his reelection bid coming in 2020. And so he wanted to knock out his most serious rival before the election season even got started. Okay? Now, here's the thing with those kinds of telephone calls. Multiple people are also listening in. Okay? First and foremost, oftentimes you need a translator. But secondly, you also have people that are on the call that are experts in the regions where the president is calling. And it just so happens somebody on the National Security Council who was listening in on the call understood that what Donald Trump was doing was an abuse of his constitutional power. Now, Donald Trump subsequently argued that it was a perfect phone call. But nevertheless, it has been pretty well substantiated that he did basically threaten to withhold congressionally appropriated funds that Congress wanted dispersed for essentially a personal reason. For his own personal reelection bid. Now, again, your interpretation of this is going to vary, okay? You may, if you are a Democrat, you almost certainly think that this was a horrendous abuse and a corrupt use of presidential authority to sequester money. There is actually a law called the Sequestration Act that sharply limits what presidents can do in terms of withholding money that had been, or it's actually called the Impoundment Act, where the president really has limits in terms of their ability to simply take money that's been appropriated and not spend it for the purpose that Congress had authorized that spending to take place. And so, if you're a Democrat, you think what he did was impeachable. But if you're a Republican, you think, well, Donald Trump did it. He was president at the time. Therefore, it was constitutional. I think as a factual matter, what he did was an abuse of authority. Okay? That's just what I think. I think if Joe Biden had done the same thing, that Republicans would have been launching an impeachment effort against him. So that's sort of my criterion. If the other side thinks that, the other side had done it, that they would be impeaching, then it might be impeachable. But, that's just me. In a demonstration that turnabout is fair play, many conservative whistleblowers emerged over the course of Biden's single term of office, alleging that the administration had ordered the cover-up of Hunter Biden's tax evasion. That they slow-walked it, that they didn't do what they would have done to a normal American citizen, and so forth. And again, I guess the proof will be in the pudding. Hunter Biden has been convicted on a gun charge. He is now facing a trial in Los Angeles where I guess he was living at the time, that he had evaded taxes. Now, this is also an instance where it's been alleged that Hunter, I believe it's a matter of public report, that Hunter Biden has paid those back taxes. Now, ordinarily, tax evasion is not prosecuted when the person being accused has actually paid the arrears that they have allowed to accrue. Again, this is the question is this a legitimate use of police authority? You oftentimes heard Donald Trump talking about lawfare, that this was a situation where Democrats and the Biden administration in particular are going after the person of Donald Trump simply because he is a rival and a person likely to seek the presidency. They also went after a Democratic senator from New Jersey. His name is Robert Menendez, for bribery. He had been bribed by Egyptian, business interests. He was caught with gold bars in his closet, and they ultimately did go after Hunter Biden. Whether you think it's malfeasance or whatever, the question's going to be what's going to happen going forward, and if the likelihood is that Donald Trump is going to use the Department of Justice as a political cudgel against people that he has a grievance against, then you're going to have a very interesting 4 years, in terms of how the Department of Justice wields that awesome, investigative and prosecutorial power. You also have the importance of citizen oversight, okay? The Freedom of Information Act, which was passed by Congress in 1966, gives ordinary citizens the power to request records from any federal agency. Now, that is, again, it is the prospect of this, the rationale for this is that the best, the best remedy for infection is sunlight. And so this is one of this is the federal government's ultimate sunlight law, okay? So journalists and ordinary citizens, it's typically journalists that invoke this, but increasingly political activists also file dozens and dozens of FOIA requests, to the extent that oftentimes government agencies view these kinds of requests as nuisance claims, or nuisance requests. There are 9 categories of areas that are exempt from FOIA, from Freedom of Information Act requests. Those are typically what we might call matters that are touching on private citizens. Okay, the personal privacy of federal employees. So when you're talking about, for example, their health records, when you're talking about personnel matters, personnel management matters, those are 2 of the 9 kind of broad categories of things that that really FOIA requests are not covered by. A good example of sort of the FOIA request actually producing serious revelations was a reporter made a FOIA request to the Centers for Disease Control in 2017. And the request kind of was poorly redacted, and the journalist was able to figure out that the Centers for Disease Control had attempted to suppress a series of accidents that occurred within its labs and that had resulted in the release of dangerous pathogens like anthrax. Okay? And that reporter, in publishing it, it was a bombshell report, and it led to Congress holding oversight hearings and really, pushing the Centers for Disease Control. And it really was it was a hit to the Centers for Disease Control. This is an example of fire alarm oversight, where Congress is calling people to the carpet and saying, what in the heck are you guys doing in your labs? It remains I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory or not, But it remains widely believed in certain political circles that COVID-19 was a pathogen released by a lab in a foreign country. It was, the argument is that it was released in a, bat, a lab in China that studies in Wuhan, China, that studies coronaviruses, which are viruses that are particular to bats, and bats oftentimes, spin off these viruses that can be caught by human beings. Now, the alternative to that is that there was a marketplace that dealt in exotic animals, meat from exotic animals, that was also in Wuhan, and that it might have emerged there. Your mileage will vary as to which you think is true. And the problem here is that we're not going to know because China's not going to tell us. China is a totalitarian society, and they're not interested in showing us their dirty laundry. Now that makes it problematical because we do have, we have grants that we have given to China to further the study of coronavirus because immunologists want to know as much as possible about that kind of thing. There are actually close connections between the Chinese scientific community of epidemiologists and immunologists and American, disease scientists. And so that has also been controversial, and I have no doubt that will continue to be investigated. I know you have one senator, Rand Paul of Kentucky, who has basically alleged that the head of the National Institutes of Health somehow was guilty of having, of spreading the coronavirus, and would like to see that person probably investigated and prosecuted. This is a 90-year-old guy that's retired. So again, there are problems with managing bureaucracies, okay? The smooth operation of the federal government requires civil servants who are experts committed to the impartial and uniform implementation of laws and regulations. But at times, it's clear bureaucrats get involved, right? If you are passionate about something that you're doing, you get an idea that this is the right way to do it and this is the wrong way to do it. The failures of, that I mentioned at the start of my first presentation on bureaucracy, of the Veterans Health Administration was an example of bureaucratic failure. Bureaucratic agencies can also be subject to regulatory capture. This is what happened to the Federal Aviation Administration with Boeing. Boeing, rushed the production of the Boeing 737 Supermax. They took shortcuts. And it created problems, caused crashes, people died, because that regulatory agency, first and foremost, lacked the expertise to seriously understand what Boeing was doing and why what they were doing was wrong. So are we returning to the spoils system? As candidate, Trump promised to revive his attempt to reclassify tens of thousands of career civil service as appointees without civil service protection. His running mate, J.D. Vance, has advocated firing every mid-level bureaucrat and replacing them with Trump loyalists. Trump's demand of congressional Republicans to basically just go into recess, again, raises this question. Are we going to see a purge in the coming days? So, to conclude, bureaucracy, what do you think? So here are some questions. Some people argue that Americans' liberties are threatened by too large an administrative state, while others contend that a bureaucracy with too few resources is the real threat. Based on what you've learned over the course of these presentations, what do you think? Which is the bigger problem? Number two, are there ways in which you have benefited from bureaucratic action or been harmed by it? What types of bureaucratic activity are the most noticeable to you that you've learned more about, in terms of learning about the role of bureaucracy in government? What kinds of reforms would you make to make the bureaucracy more accountable, but also more responsive to what the public wants? These are some important questions. So that's it for our discussion of bureaucracy. When we come back, we're going to take up a related issue, a very important issue of the other constitutional branch of government, the federal judiciary and the role that they play in interpreting the laws and ensuring that the laws are being constitutionally upheld. I'll see you next time.